Welcome, everyone. Today, I am really thrilled to introduce you to my guest, Tiffany Harnsongkram. Did I say that right?
Yep, you
Yes.
got it.
Tiffany is the founder of From Divorce to Destiny. She's also involved as Chief Impact Officer at Venture Rock and has supported some of the wealthiest families and business leaders on the planet. She serves as an advisor for organizations including WM Nexus, Ethical Markets, and Nijovu Foundation. Tiffany also has 3 nationalities and 3 continents that she calls home. She also holds a master's and is certified as a Soma neuromuscular integration therapist. She went through a high conflict divorce that included high conflict custody changes, international litigation, and offshore holdings, the kind that made all the judges and attorneys' heads start spinning. Because of this experience, she is well aware that the family court systems are totally unprepared for dealing with high conflict family matters. And she knows that the real victories are not in the courtroom or to be measured in dollars. They are in our ability to claim our power and our sacred life's purpose. You can imagine why I love talking with Tiffany, her approach, her thoughtfulness. I am so happy to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm delighted to talk to you too. I know the first time we talked, we had an amazing conversation. I was like, yes, this woman, she gets it. She gets it all.
Yeah, it's so good to connect to people who get what this process can be and see the possibility. So I love From Divorce to Destiny. So I like to start the podcast asking everyone the same question, which is, what's one word you would use to describe your divorce?
Oh, that one is really easy for me, actually. It's rebirth. It was a rebirthing process. That's why I chose the Phoenix as my logo, because it was the burning down of the old and the rebuilding life anew, but coming out, more full of myself in the best way I can say that, my authentic self.
I love that. And I'm curious, thinking about rebirth, did you know in the relationship, like, were there moments where you knew you weren't your authentic self? Like, when did that start? I think about it as like the little voices starting where you realize, oh, maybe I'm not authentic. Or did it take leaving the relationship to realize that you hadn't been your authentic self?
Yeah, that's an astute question, because I think when talking about me personally, I didn't realize how much I had given up. I
Mm,
hadn't, I didn't realize what a small box I had been putting myself in until I allowed myself to break out of it. And then you start realizing, you know, why did I accept that? Or that
yeah.
this isn't the way it's normally supposed to be? Or what if, there's a different way of doing things? And it was an unpeeling process. Um, and it still, continues. I
Mm,
mean, we all have programmings we grow up with. And luckily, going through the divorce helped me to get rid of a lot of that, around my identity as a wife,
mm,
my identity as a mother, my identity as a Christian,
mhm,
my identity as a good person, or as somebody who does things correctly. I'll put it that
mhm,
way. And yeah, so I didn't have a choice at that point to let those all kind of go,
mm.
kicking and screaming perhaps, but I had to let them go.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized how bound I had been by all of those expectations,
Yeah.
all of
And
those rules.
were there moments, because it takes us people a long time, and I try to explain that it's going to take however it's going to take, for people. Um,
Mm.
like, were there moments where you thought, oh, maybe this relationship isn't right for me, or I'm not my best self, but that's okay. I'm going to keep going anyway. Like, did you have those thoughts and keep persevering and not listen to them?
Well, I think I had that thought, maybe even just before getting married, maybe this wasn't the right thing for me. I didn't know
Mhm.
why.
Yeah.
And then you make concessions in relationships where, oh, well, I'm making too big of a deal out of it, or it'll solve itself, or I'll give it some time. maybe I should just forgive or leave it behind. And so I don't think that it was registering in my mind as a life choice so much as
Mm,
it was like, oh, just this time, until just this time becomes years. And then when I really decided that I wanted to leave the marriage at that point, you know, 3 years went by before I actually did, and a
yeah.
few ups and downs and mind changes in between then. But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it took me a while, because for me it was giving up a lot. As I said, all of those identities of how things should have been, my entire life goal plan was, it's a lot to give up.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you're bringing up all of those identities and these parts of you that you were trying to keep, um,
Mm,
even if the relationship was not supporting your best self. Um,
exactly.
right. And
Hmm.
I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about kind of what was your first healing experience, either in while you were getting the divorce or post the divorce, that really, you mentioned earlier patterns, but what was some healing that you got that kind of pushed you from seeing the divorce as a devastation into a rebirth?
Well, I think the first healing came from paying attention to how I felt when I left.
Mm,
Despite all the devastation, I felt free. I felt like I had a say in my life, in
mm,
the direction of my life, and how I was going to live my life. I
mm.
didn't know how much of a say I had, but I felt this expansion, this ease, this freedom that somehow didn't match with my life circumstance from the outside, but
Yeah.
internally, I just, like, I could just breathe. And then from there, I did go into healing modalities. I think I shared with you, EMDR was one that helped me through the crisis points where I was having a hard time just, going through the day, allowing myself to settle in. But some of the greatest teachers that I dove into at the time were people like Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle and Teal Swan, getting me away from the stories that I had about everything and just being in the present moment and paying attention to what was actually going on within me. And then externally, and learning how to create my external life from my internal reflections, from my internal processes, to even know what I wanted, which was a question that I never took the space to ask myself before.
Ah, I love this point, Tiffany. So important, right? Because when you're going through a divorce, there's so many external requirements, there's so many external demands. And I guess we have a choice, right? Where we can either attack each of those as if they're a new experience, or see them as all happening to us that has a core central way of being in the world. It's a
Yeah.
different way of approaching. It's like looking at the stressors versus the stress, and how do we manage the stress, how do we make ourselves
Yeah.
able to manage stress in general, so that, because you can't ever control the stressors. So I love this idea of you getting, I can just feel it like in my body,
Hmm.
just this grounding net, this groundedness that you needed to get to before you could deal with, what was an incredibly high conflict, difficult divorce situation.
Yeah. And that's what the process allowed me. It's like when everything outside looked like it was falling apart. So I was left essentially penniless with two children under the age of 5. I was in to me, pretty foreign country, even though I am French, but this was not where I grew up. And so I was in the countryside in France, didn't have friends, didn't have a support system. I just had my mom and my girls with me, and my mother was sick. And, so from the outside, it looked like an absolute tornado. And so being forced to go inside and settle myself that way also taught me about how much power I actually had in creating life, how I had attracted those things to me. I think I was in a place where I felt like, how did everything happened to me. How did I become such a victim? How did everything blow up in my face? Like, I tried to make the right choices. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to be the good girl. And now all of this stuff has just happened to me. And going from that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness to the feeling of, oh my gosh, I actually created all of this through my lack of consciousness about what I had allowed and what I was attracting to myself by my way of being. And then I realized my powerlessness was actually illusion. I was really, really powerful. And now I had to pay attention to what I was creating and pay attention to my state of being so that I didn't reproduce that in the future, so that I could produce a better future.
Yes, yes. I mean, amen. This is what what I speak about in my book and in all of my work. That's why we're so in sync, because, it's this idea of the short-term pain for long-term gain. Like, it is uncomfortable to look at yourself and think, how did I end up here? I know it was hard for me to do that. And I had similarly to you, I had
Yeah.
a whole story of why they were the problem. And they did have problems, but I
Sure.
couldn't change that. Right. And then, so it's uncomfortable, but with compassion, if we look at how we ended up here gently, lovingly, so that we don't end up there again, I just feel like it is a small moment in time of
Mm,
pain to look at that for so much long-term gain, because then you have a blueprint, right? You know how you move in the world, you know how you interact. As you said, you finally know what you need. And so then that is what changes their victimhood, is knowing yourself, because then no, you can't be a victim if
yeah.
you are your biggest powerful ally.
Yeah. So that's, I think we can both say that that's, where we are now, where we've reaped the benefits and the fruit of that labor. And I'm taking myself back to that point of what was the hardest part of making that transition. I think was growing up in the idea, in a very childish idea of that I was at the affect of all these big, important, powerful people making decisions, and I was just, having to go along with it. And I just had a tiny bit of decision to make myself. But in reality, I was kind of a passenger in the boat. Going from that to the very scary idea of that I had been driving the boat and that I was meant to be driving the boat and I was probably crashing it, was a level of responsibility that I had never ever considered in my life. And it was terrifying because it meant that I was, not responsible for 10% of my life. I was responsible for 90% of it. And having the courage to actually admit that and to try to figure out how to drive the boat and be responsible for where you're driving people who are around you that are at the affect of your driving, let's say. I think that was the scariest part in making that leap. And then after that, it got much easier. But just admitting that I had that amount of control was terrifying.
Absolutely. And how much we disavow, I think, when we're brought up in different homes or as women or people of
Mm-hmm.
color, we disavow our power, right? We
Yeah.
shift it away. And one reason why I also, one thing that came up when we talked, what I was really hoping you would shed some light on, is to talk a little bit about part of your healing also involved having to heal from the shame, the religious shame and guilt
Mm-hmm.
of being
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
religious practicing person. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that process for you, for the audience.
Yeah. I think this is one of the main reasons why many women and men stay in really bad marriages, is because they don't want to disavow their faith, or they don't want to commit a sin or a misstep there, and they're willing to put up with all kinds of abuse as long as it doesn't fit into the two prescriptions which are really taught by the church, is that you can divorce if your spouse has been unfaithful, or you can divorce if your spouse first wants to divorce you and is an unbeliever. Those are, generally taught as the two allowed forms of divorce, and even then you're not supposed to get remarried. um, and having gone to Bible college, having been very involved in the church, I was even studying, the root scripture in Greek and in Hebrew, the
Mm.
original text. I went really deep into my faith, and so that was probably the most difficult part for me in getting over identity issues. And I did have a crisis of faith when I divorced. And now, I wouldn't say that I label myself to be any kind of religion, but what I did was I went and I studied the texts again,
Mm.
more in depth and with the patriarchal lens off, and looking at the history, looking at the cultural context and history. And I did, come up with a mini course regarding the historical context and going through it verse by verse for people who are really intellectual and heady and want to get granular. But I'll give you the cliff notes, which
Please.
is what we have been taught about what's allowed and what's not allowed in divorce is false in the church. And if you want to follow the church's prescription, you need to take it as a whole, which is um, your spirit comes first. Your relationship to spirit comes first. And anyone who is impeding that is not a partner and is certainly not your spiritual partner. We need to get away from this idea that we can be spiritually partnered with somebody who is detrimental to us, and that's a good thing.
Yes.
And how could that possibly be supported by spiritual teachers? And then you look back at the history and you find patriarchy as the root. So it's an interesting study, but what the message is that your spirit is divine and your life here is sacred. You are meant to be living it. You are meant to be living it as yourself, not living it in, yeah, in suffering and in sacrifice, because this is a distortion. This is a distortion of truth. You were created unique. You were created divinely unique, and if you don't get to express that, um, you are negating your life, really, truly, your gift. Um, and we should never feel ashamed for that. And I think the best testimony to people who would be afraid of maybe fellow church members or faith members or maybe family who are putting pressure, I say, let them watch you. At first they might fuss, and at first they might be very concerned with your emotional and spiritual health. However, when they see how well you're doing in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, you will not have to explain that anymore. I certainly didn't.
Mm. What a beautiful reframing, right? Of something very hierarchical and
Mm,
patriarchal into supportive, spiritual, relating to your spirit. And I love how you're
mm,
bringing that back. And it's true. Would God or whatever higher power you believe in really support you in being held back from your true self? Like how would that possibly be the wish, right?
right? It's a twisting, it's a distortion. And quite frankly, I think it's evil. I mean, how many people have given years, if not their entire sacred life on this earth, in sacrifice to these rules that
Yes,
weren't that weren't real.
right. And really favored only one gender as well.
Highly
Right.
benefited one gender very
One gender.
specifically, but truly, I mean, does it benefit any gender? Think about the man
No.
who has his wife that's married to him because she has to be, and she's not really loving, she's not really supportive, and she's probably not making love to him either. So how frustrated is he? How lonely is
Exactly.
he? This
Exactly.
is not a holy partnership.
No.
It's a shell.
And to think also about our requirement of continuing, what we're continuing with generations of, if we want to continue spirit with generations, what are we teaching our children about,
Mm,
I talk about this a lot, like white knuckling it through a relationship. What are you
right.
teaching them? Are you teaching them to be more connected to their spirit and their desires, or are you teaching them to be more connected to, as you said before, the shoulds and the musts? And I think you really need to think about, these religions have lasted a long time, like legacy matters. So what are you teaching?
Well, that's why I left ultimately, was because I saw the example that I was giving my children.
Mm,
2 daughters. So specifically, I mean, I didn't want them growing up in the same relationship dynamic where I felt completely unseen and undervalued. I thought, well, would I want my daughters in this marriage? And
right.
do I even want them witnessing our interactions right now? Because they were already pretty,
Exactly. Pretty.
pretty unhealthy.
Yeah. And I think people really need to understand that um, what they're going to believe relationships are what they see. I know some clients will say,
Yeah.
well, I'll tell them this isn't a good relationship, so they'll find a different one. It doesn't matter what we say to our children. It's what we model. It's what we embody. And so I agree with you. I don't think you can ever play tricks on your children. They're always going to
Yeah.
see
Oh,
through,
they're so
right?
smart.
They're so
Mm-hmm.
wise. There are teachers as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your girls, and I was hoping the other thing that I really was hoping we could talk about today that that's unique to your story, but not to other people, just we haven't talked about this on
Mm,
the podcast yet, is about being the parent who does not have full custody of their children. And I'm wondering if you can
yeah.
talk a little bit about your custody situation, how it came up, and how you so beautifully and gracefully accept it and are with it.
Yeah. So, as I explained, I was left, with my 2 daughters out here in the countryside. And when I started dating again, my ex-husband decided to come and win me back. And he pulled out all the stops to try to win me back because he had heard that I was dating again. And it didn't work. I was clearly, not going to erase the many years that had happened before with a bouquet of flowers. But however, the second rejection was incredibly painful or infuriating. I'm not sure, I'm trying to imagine his mental state. But at that point, he accused me of attempted kidnapping of our children and filed for full custody. And because he did that just a few days before we went to court, I didn't have any forewarning or any way to prove that that wasn't true. And so the judge gave him, I'll say, about 70% custody and me about 30%. So I was still in regular contact with the children. But for me, that was unthinkably devastating because I had always taken care of my daughters. I had always been the person, when we were married. I mean, he didn't change a single diaper on my second daughter. He didn't know how to take care of them. So it was terrifying for me as well, knowing that the girls were going to be in his care. And at that point, I went into fight or flight. Like, my mind was going, oh my gosh, what do I do? Do I just, take the children and run? Do I try to get an attorney, but I don't have any money? And what, like all of these crazy, powerless thoughts going through my head. And the very unthinkable thing was for me to be a mother without custody of her children, because I thought, my gosh, the only mothers that this happens to are mothers who are in and out of prison, mothers with severe abuse issues. I don't know, like I had this image in my head of what that mother would look like, and I couldn't be that mother. Um, and it made me again dive really, really deep into that label of what is a mother. Who what is my job as their mother, knowing that they are with their father most of the time, and that I'm not going to be able to control what they're eating, what their education is, um, who their doctor is, thing, things that I always imagined myself building up for my children and teaching them things and showing them things. And having that be gone really enlightened me to a different way of thinking about motherhood as stewardship and as mentorship, knowing that I wasn't going to be able to teach them all of the things that I had planned. They weren't going to be in all the programs that I wanted them to be in and all this stuff. I really thought, how do I give my best to these girls in the time that I have with them? And how can I flourish so that I can mentor these girls and so they can see that example, and
Mm,
not put my happiness on their shoulders, or my unhappiness at this current situation, which I was clearly very unhappy, on their shoulders as well.
mm.
So that was one of my biggest challenges. And now I'm happy to say that their father has asked me to take 50-50 custody now after a few years of doing that. However, it was a long road. I went back to court 4 times. Four
Mhm.
times requesting, custody back, and the judges not wanting to reverse the opinion of the
Yeah.
other judges. We live in a small town. We live in a very small town.
Mm.
So and me looking like the foreigner and me sounding like a foreigner was, I mean, very, very clearly, they were biased towards the local person.
Mhm.
Um, so, having that kind of disappointment and fighting so hard to get custody back and not having it, made me have to trust that there was a bigger plan,
Yeah.
and they're okay. My daughters are okay. I thought that this would surely screw them up. And no, I had to let go
Yeah.
of the illusion that I was going to make them okay.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I mean, so many thoughts. I mean, but first of all, just how important it is to talk about um, the misconceptions we have about what motherhood is, especially when
Mm,
going through a divorce, that there is this idea of I'm going to make it all better for them.
yeah.
And, I think a lot of people, I had full custody. And so I know I felt a huge relief. Like I was going to control this whole thing because I had all the custody. I mean, I had no, I mean, it's as if somehow this numbers 50-50 tells you that,
Yeah,
right? Like that what you can control,
yeah,
and you can't control the
exactly.
other person or their experience at all. But I think it gives you this false sense. And you were really pushed to think, wait a minute, what is my impact here? What kind of
Mm,
impact can I have? In some ways you were given, now of course both so deeply painful, but also the gift of really defining what kind of mother you wanted to be. And this idea of stewardship is so beautiful. And I feel like it's a question maybe we should all ask ourselves, what kind of mother or what kind of father, like what do I stand for? What's my mission statement as a mother? And if I only see my kids, let's say 2 days a week, what do I want that time and that experience to stand for? What a powerful question.
yeah, that's exactly it. I think, I never would have been forced to ask myself that, if I distill down what I want to hand my children for their success, the
Yeah.
foundation I want them to build their life on, how do I do that in a weekend? How do I do that, by sending them things on the phone or by, having them read books or whatever? I really had to distill it down to the core essence of, what I could provide them, and the full respect that these are little souls coming into the world with their own journey, with their own life mission.
Yes.
They are asking their own questions, and never would I have been able to guess who these people would be when they came out of me, but they certainly were very opinionated as to the life they wanted to experience. And my opinion had very little to do with it. I can just support and love in that, and help to guide. But boy, do they have distinctive gifts,
Yes.
distinctive questions, very different from one another.
Yeah. And I think what you were given also was this focus, right? I mean, I think as a
Yeah.
parent who, we can feel sometimes that by making the appointments of the doctors, making the course classes, like all of those logistical things, that somehow we're molding our children. But there's so
Mm.
much more than the logistics. There's the holding space, there's the way you ask questions, it's the books you recommend, right? There's so many other pieces. And I do think it gets lost sometimes, kind of the quality versus the quantity, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. Before I had been thinking of, what books do I want them to read? What classes do I want them to take? What influences, schools of thought do I want them raised by? And now a lot of it is in the quality of our interaction and in the quality of who I can be apart from them and for them
Yeah.
is my big challenge is I think that children test us more than anyone because they know us from the inside out. And
Yeah.
being able to hold your composure and your sovereignty and your calm in the face of whatever these kids are going to come up with, because
Yeah.
they will, because
Yes.
they are our teachers, and modeling that to them,
Yes.
modeling boundaries, modeling
Mhm.
love, modeling, what is it, nonviolent communication skills,
Yeah.
all of these things, through whatever, through whatever they're going through whatever we're going through. That's really
Exactly.
powerful stuff.
So powerful. And I want to really highlight a point you just made, that how you are with when they're not there also impacts them. How you
Mhm.
take care of yourself, how you nurture yourself, how you explore yourself, how you learn, how you push yourself, that impacts them. So it's not just when they're there. You are their parent always.
Yeah. And that was one thing that, I had to pull myself out of. I was so involved with everything that was going on with them that I didn't have my own life. And that's why I felt like a small version of myself, or an empty shell, partially as I had put myself in that role of revolving my entire life around my children. And
Mm,
what pressure that puts on the children.
mm-hmm.
What responsibility are we putting on their shoulders when our lives revolve around how they're doing, how they're feeling, if they're doing well or not, if they're behaving or not behaving, modeling that I'm going to be okay no matter what mood you're in.
Yes.
Or I'm going to be okay if you're not doing well in school, or if you're doing great in school. Like, it's all good. It's all
Yeah.
good.
It's all good.
Everything's fine. We love each other. We're all taken care of.
We can move through anything together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to ask you, we could talk for hours. These are such important topics. Thank you for sharing your open heart and your vulnerability. In conclusion, I'd like to ask you a question I often ask, which is, if you could go back as your adult self now, what message would you give your past self when she was starting to venture down this path?
Oh, goodness. I haven't asked myself that question, even though, I kind of created a course around trying to help people avoid a lot of the things that, I took a long time to go through. But I would say, if I had to distill it down, I would say you have no idea how powerful you are. You have no idea how amazing you are. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like a rah thing. I mean, I
Yeah.
really at that time had no even inkling or imagination of what my life would be today.
Yeah. Your power. I love that. I want people who are listening really to hear that I think a theme of this conversation has been about owning, knowing, valuing
Mm,
your power as a spiritual person, as an individual, as a parent, that you have power even if you're feeling powerless.
yeah, you summed it up perfectly.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for coming and speaking. Can you let people know how they can find out about your work?
Yes. Yeah. So I made an online course called Thriving Through Divorce, which is about a conscious divorce process. And that's on my website, From Divorce to Destiny. But if you're curious about the recovering from religious shame and guilt, that's like a mini course. And High Conflict Co-Parenting Hacks is also a mini course, to help with those, those more kind of poignant situations. So yeah, you can find me on my website and get those videos and downloads.
Great. And we'll have that all on in the show notes as well. Thank
Oh,
you
thank you.
so much, Tiffany, for being here, sharing your heart, sharing your soul with our audience. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, a pleasure. And thanks for hosting the podcast.
My pleasure.